right, excellent. Well, let's jump into our stuff for tonight. Okay, so we've been kind of unpacking this of the visions and what God is doing in that overall renewal project. So renewing creation, that we're going to see in Revelation 21 and 22. The redeeming humanity, that is something we have seen already Jesus is doing. And we saw Revelation 4 and 5 where the song was, a new song. You have purchased men from every tribe, tongue, and nation with your blood. So there is the redeeming humanity. Now, the sections that we're going to focus on tonight and next week really focus on that third piece, restoring the cosmic order, specifically defeating rebellious spiritual forces. Again, not something that we talk about a whole lot. But if you and I were growing up in first century Judaism, and the question came up, how did the sin of Adam and Eve spread to the whole world? How in the world did we get all this idolatry and immorality? How did all of these things like warfare and bloodshed and stuff, how did that spread to all the nations of the world? We say, oh yeah, Genesis 6. Clearly, that's where it started. And what happened in Genesis 6? This crazy passage where the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful. And they went into them and they bore children who were the giants of old, the Nephilim. What is that all about? Now, that's something that, we don't talk about a whole lot. And part of that is in our tradition, we don't have a whole lot of extra stuff. Every so often in the Old Testament, you've got little mentions of Nephilim, Anakim, Rephaim, all these various types of groups, and they are the giants, this kind of thing. There's this connection with Goliath and Og of Bashan, who apparently was so big they had to build a special bed for him, and these characters. But it's not really something we talk about a whole lot. However, in the period between the finishing of the Old Testament and the writing of the New Testament, there was additional literature that was floating around, okay? Now, some of that literature we have discovered in places like the Dead Sea Scrolls or in ancient synagogues where there are books. Oftentimes we find all of the books of the Hebrew Scripture, and then occasionally there's a few other books. Well, one of them that's floating around is called the Book of Enoch. And it's divided into 5 different sections. And the first section is called the Book of the Watchers. And Enoch uses this term watchers to describe these fallen angels that stirred up trouble in Genesis chapter 6. If you are fascinated by this, you can pick up your own copy of the Apocryphal Old Testament. Now just $19.95, operator standing by. So this one is edited by HFD Sparks. Kind of a well-accepted translation into English, includes a lot of other Jewish literature from in between, but including the Book of Enoch. And in Enoch, it unpacks Genesis 6. And it says there was a group of 200 angels that came down. They decided they were tired of God calling all the shots. And they decided they were going to come down to earth and stir up trouble. And they were going to try to tempt humanity to worship other deities and to worship them in ways that included immoral practices and bloodshed. And they taught these things to people. And you say, wow, well, that's weird and that's interesting, but what does that really have to do with what's going on here? Well, here's the thing. We actually know that quite a few of the early Jewish Christians were aware of 1 Enoch because they quote from it. The book of Jude and 2 Peter quote directly from 1 Enoch and include them in their writings. So even though 1 Enoch is not a book of the Bible, it's quoted in the New Testament. So that tells us, okay, it at least was impacting the way they were thinking about things. And so we're going to get into these sections where we see these interesting battles between Jesus, Michael, the angels that are loyal to God, the 2/3 of the angelic force that stayed true to Yahweh and said, we will submit and we will do your bidding, those 2/3. But you've got this other 1/3 that that leave, and they follow after Satan, who is also called the great red dragon. Okay? The great red dragon is thrown out. And 1/3 of the stars, which is a coded language for the angels, they decide to follow after. So he's quite an influential guy, quite a speech maker, rallied the troops and said, why do we have to just listen to everything Yahweh says? Who is he? Well, he's the guy who created everything. So let me be clear on this, because this is kind of confusing. Nowhere in 1 Enoch or the apocryphal literature does it ever describe another deity like Yahweh that is equal in power. He alone has the power to create. He alone is the one that called life into being, all right? Then you have angels, which are messengers. And so we have good angels that follow what God tells them to do. We have fallen angels or demons that are serving themselves or serving evil. And then we have something in between that. These sort of spiritual beings that seem to have a higher rank. Paul talks about this in Ephesians 6, that rulers, principalities, powers, authorities, kind of this hierarchy of forces. Now we see that on God's side. You obviously have God at the very top. But then you've got special angels like Gabriel, Michael, that are higher level than some of the others. It appears that the same thing is true on the side of evil, that you've got some forces that are a little stronger. Some of these we see in the Bible. When Daniel is praying, right? And Gabriel shows up, but he shows up kind of late. He's like, sorry, got delayed. Big accident on 84. Sorry, it took me a while to get here. I was being held up by the Prince of Persia. And the Prince of Persia was delaying me until Michael, the archangel, who protects your people. So, okay, side note, Michael is designated as the angel that guards Israel. Michael, the archangel who guards your people, fought for me so that I could get through. What in the world is going on? Gabriel is trying to answer Daniel's prayer. Daniel is here in the earthly realm. His prayer goes to heaven. But the Prince of Persia from the Hades realm, or from Sheol, is preventing Gabriel from getting through. So Michael has to step in, knock some heads around, and Gabriel's able to get through. Oh my goodness. Okay, so that's a brief unpacking of there's a lot going on, and more than meets the eye. So when we get into these battles, we're going to have to unpack a little bit here, and here's where we're really going to use our chart and say, what visions is John having of stuff that takes place here, and what visions take place here? Because we're going to see some battles that take place. And the question will be, are these different battles, or perhaps the same event that's taking place at different levels, or the same event that John is seeing from different perspectives? So we're getting into kind of the weirder part of Revelation and trying to understand some of those things. But all this to say, those two passages in Jude and 2 Peter that talk about fallen angels say these fallen rebellious angels that rebelled against God are being held in a prison at the bottom of Hades awaiting their judgment. Okay? Angels being held in prison. Well, we're now going to get to the part of Revelation where the judgment is going to happen. And this is important for us to understand. Some of the judgments that we'll come across are not tribulations that happen in the earthly realm here. Some of the judgments are God bringing a spiritual judgment against the rebellious spiritual forces that go all the way back to Genesis chapter 6. And now there's going to be a judgment or a punishment for bringing sin, idolatry, immorality, murder, all these things onto our planet. These things were introduced from outside of the system. Okay? How you doing with all that? Yeah, just Super clear. You remember this from Sunday school, right? You just All right. So these are some of the weird passages of the Bible. But in the first century, in the Jewish tradition, these were things that were being discussed. They were being talked about. And as they looked at earthly powers, okay, so if we go through all the way up to the time of Revelation and they looked backward, they could see earthly powers that had persecuted the people of God. Egypt, Babylon, the Hittites, the Philistines. And we move into the later period, the Persians, the Greeks, and now the Romans. But these are earthly powers, but the understanding for the Jewish nation was there is a spiritual power working behind those things. And that spiritual power sometimes had a name: Prince of Persia, Prince of Rome, these kinds of things. So when we get into talking about Babylon or the great harlot that reclines on 7 hills, well, that's a very thinly veiled reference, because everybody knew Rome was the city built on 7 hills. Okay? So there was even the goddess Roma that was the patron deity of Rome. So there's an understanding that in the earthly realm, the Roman Empire is oppressing the Christians and the Jews. But lying behind that power is a spiritual force. And lying behind that spiritual force, so the Prince of Persia, that's trouble, but that's not the big boss. All right? Those of you that are gamers, you got to work your way up to the big boss. That's not a lot in this crowd, I'm sure. Your grandkids, when they're gaming, right? They're like, hang on, Grandma, I'm going to come for dinner. I got to finish this level. What they mean is I got to beat the next boss, because if you beat that boss, you go to the bigger boss. The same is true here. You got to defeat the small bosses, the local demons, so you get to the big boss, the princes, so you get to the bigger boss that's behind that, the great red dragon. So we're going to get into this when we talk about things like the great red dragon, big boss that is the power behind the beast. The beast represents the Roman Empire. And the beast has a couple of other beasts, the beast from the sea and the beast from the earth. These are smaller powers related to the Roman Empire, as well as a false prophet that is the voice of the beast. So all of this is kind of wrapped into this hierarchy of spiritual forces. So this piece of restoring the cosmic order and defeating rebellious spiritual forces, as well as punishing earthly forces that have persecuted the people of God, both Jews and Christians, is what we're going to get into in the judgment. We're also going to see judgment for those humans that refuse to repent. Those humans that in the course of the process of revelation are going to be aware that Jesus is the Lamb of God, that Jesus is the one who has come and he really is the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. But even with that awareness, they're going to say, no, thank you. I'd rather do it my own way. So that spirit of human rebellion and human independence, I don't need God, that goes all the way back to the garden, right? It's like, you just had one job. Don't eat from one tree. I've given you the entire orchard. But this one tree, yeah, please don't. Ooh, all of a sudden that one gets exciting, huh? And so there's human rebellion and selfishness that's involved as well. So when we get into the punishments and those various things, that's what we're going to see happening. Okay, as well as defeating some forces that even go beyond sort of the personification of these forces. You've got Satan and the dragon and these things, but you've also got forces like death itself. Sin and death are also regarded as being powers that must be defeated. These are powers that are not part of what's on earth. I really enjoyed this morning that discussion between Pastor Tim and Tim Anstein, and they were talking about this idea of we were not made to die. That was the original intent in the garden. We were made to live forever in the presence of God. When sin and death come in, they are foreign elements in the garden. that also have to be defeated. Now, this is one of those where we have the already and the not yet. Already, when Jesus died, he died so that sin could be forgiven. But even in our own life, that's not applied and made effective until we willfully receive it, right? And the same is true here. As we go through Revelation, we will see that eventually sin will be completely defeated, as well as disease, injustice, and finally, the last enemy is death. You say, well, didn't Jesus defeat death at the tomb? He did for himself. His own death was defeated when he rose from the tomb. However, that death, there's still elements of that that have to be defeated. We can simply look at that and say, do Christians still physically die? Yes, we do. All right? We are susceptible to death. Death still has a hold on us. So that's what I mean by Jesus defeated death, and that will be applied to us at his return, and we also will rise. We sang it in the closing song. On that day we'll join the resurrection and stand beside the heroes of our faith. Okay, so what happens there? That is when all of the faithful, going back to the time of Moses and Abraham, will stand at the resurrection with new glorified bodies, just like Jesus, to live in the new creation. That's when we can say death is ultimately and finally defeated. All right? So, when we get to the battles in Revelation, that's where we're going in the chapters tonight and next week. These battles are against all that stuff. And those are all the victories that God is looking to win. So I wanted to drop that in. I didn't drop it in a few weeks ago because it was like, no, this is too much. This is too much. Let us wait on this. So now we can actually put that in there and start talking about these spiritual forces, because we're going to get into these various forces and how God is working against them. Okay? All right. Before we jump ahead, any questions on that? Okay. It's all just super clear. Good. You can explain it to me. No. But this slide is an important one, because I think this is the one that we really want to narrow, really want to focus in on. This is what Revelation is about. God is winning to renew creation, to redeem humanity, and to defeat those spiritual forces that have been working against him since Genesis chapter 6. All right, let's go to that next slide, and we will move forward. Okay, so we've been talking about these major blocks as we get into tribulations. So chapters 6 through 18 are really the talk about tribulation. Chapters 4 and 5, we had that heavenly vision of the throne room. Now we're moving into the 7 seals that are being opened, the 7 trumpets that are being blown, the 7 bowls of judgment. Now, I am positing that the way that I am reading this is that the first 5 seals that are opened were things that were currently happening. And when the 6th seal is open, now we're zooming forward into the future to the day of the Lord, the day that the Old Testament prophets have been talking about for millennia, and looking forward to when will God step forward and punish his enemies, both earthly and spiritual, and put all things right. That is the day of the Lord that is yet to come. So now we're, again, the already and the not yet. So the not yet is the 6th and 7th seal. The 6th seal begins the day of the Lord. John drops all these clues in there and says, here is the wrath of the one seated on the throne and the Son of Man seated to his right, the Lamb. And so here we go. So when the final seal is opened, that begins those final judgments and the return of Jesus and the battle versus evil. So the 6th seal begins the trumpets to be blown and the judgments. The 7th seal is the process of Jesus returning for those last battles. So we're going to kind of jump into now what is going on. We've already been talking about some of the scrolls and some of the things that are happening and the trumpet judgments. So we're going to move forward. Then when we get to 17 and 18 is the final downfall of Babylon. Babylon, again, is also a code word for all of those earthly powers that have been the enemies of God throughout the ages. specifically in the time of the first century, the Roman Empire. And the reason it is called Babylon is because 586 BC, Babylon destroys the city of Jerusalem. 70 AD, Rome destroys the city of Jerusalem. So they're the new Babylon, okay? So that's the cipher there, the code. And then 19 and 20 is the final battles, and then new creation and new Jerusalem. So let's get into what we're looking at with the thing. And I want to share with you something that I'm kind of working through. I was kind of excited about this. So wesleyscholar.com. All right, happened to find there was a scholar, Mark Olson, who actually did his PhD dissertation on what was John Wesley's eschatology. He looked into Wesley's sermons, his journal entries and writings, and said, where did John Wesley land on all of this? And here's the interesting thing. So you have John Wesley, the preacher, Charles Wesley, the hymn writer. Charles Wesley was more premillennial. John Wesley was amillennial and then became postmillennial. So if you want to know what were the Wesleys, well, they were kind of across the spectrum there. And part of that was when they were living in the 1700s, they were living in a time when these events of Revelation were being interpreted in very different ways. Now, one of the major accepted things there that John Wesley, unfortunately, I think he got caught up into as well, which is one that I don't agree with, is almost across the board, Protestant Christianity was saying that the beast was the Catholic Church, and that the prophet of the beast was the Pope. And so they were reading Catholicism into all of the enemies of God. And if you grew up in a particular area in the church, maybe you heard this as well, right? That the whole idea of Rome, oh, that's not the Roman Empire, that's the Roman Catholic Church. Well, this goes back to our friend Martin Luther, who looked into Revelation, and you can understand, sometimes we do this, right? He looked and said, hey, Revelation is describing my current conflict. And so my conflict with the Catholic Church is right here in the Bible. See there, I'm the good guy, the Pope is the beast, right? And so we want to be careful of that we don't read ourselves into it. Now, we have our own issues today. A lot of what I've seen, especially right before the year 2000, was to read into it and say, where is the United States of America in this book? And clearly, in the 80s and 90s, the bad guys, well, they must be Russia. That must be the communists. And the good guys, that must be us. Look, there's an eagle. There's an eagle. Clearly, that is the United States, right? And actually, some of it is kind of interesting, because if you were to go from Jerusalem on a map and go straight north, you would hit Moscow. So the forces from the north, Gog and Magog, must be Russia. Well, then Gorbachev and Perestroika and the fall of the Soviet Union happened, and publishers were scrambling. Oh man, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? Is it the Muslims? Is it Mexican drug cartels? Is it Democrats? Who is the beast now? So we're still not sure, right? We're still struggling with this. The movies are struggling with it too. Who is Bond going to fight? If we can't fight the Russians, who are the bad guys? So, we're still trying to figure out who the new bad guys are, because we need a bad guy for our movies, and we need a bad guy for Revelation. That's where I think if we were to really back up and say, what is the timeless bad guy? It's Satan. And it's the spiritual forces that are seeking to undo the goodness of creation. If we read Revelation from the view that God created a good and perfect creation and he's working hard to get back to that perfection, then it's a battle against his ancient enemies that have been trying to undo the goodness of creation from the very beginning, and now God is putting all things right. So rather than picking, bad guy du jour, we are going to say that there's some spiritual forces that are going on. Anyway, so I found this very interesting to read about where Wesley was going with all of that. He actually had some very interesting things there of, in Wesley's day, a couple of the social issues that he was speaking out against were slavery and cruelty to animals and child labor. And so he was very clear in his sermons in looking at that. He wasn't just about heavenly things or spiritual or theology. He said the church needs to address these current issues in modern day Britain. And in that, he did pull on Revelation, which I like. He looked at that and said, Revelation is God wanting to fight against racism and injustice. And so he spoke out against slavery, and he spoke out against mistreatment of children and women, and also mistreatment of animals, which was happening a lot in the industrial age in Britain. And kind of, said, hey, God is going to renew all of creation, and spoke out against that, which then C.S. Lewis wrote that into his writings with talking animals and various things. But I thought that was kind of fun, so I'm going to keep reading through this little packet here and incorporate some of that of Wesley's views. All right, cool. Let's go to the next slide, and we'll keep going through our blocks here. Okay, so we've got the day of the Lord, that, good. So now we're going to get into, from chapters 8 to 16, there's a series of battles, and it looks like 4 different battles, but we're going to unpack, is that 4 different ones? And then there's going to be shakings. Shakings that happen on earth and in the heavens. What's going on with the shakings? Again, 4, and then also 4 that appear to be a return of Christ. And you could see why that would cause some confusion. Does he return 4 times? 1 time? Twice? Okay, what happens? So we need to kind of unpack that a little bit, because that has been confusing. So that's where we're going to look at. Now, I'll skip ahead to the punchline there, and I've kind of leaned on toward this already. I think we've got one big battle, but what John is going to see is different ways that battle plays out. Sometimes the battle is to defeat the earthly forces that are against God's people. Sometimes they're to defeat the spiritual forces. Sometimes they're taking place in a realm outside of what we even understand. When we talk about the dragon pursuing the woman and these kinds of things, that kind of thing. The shakings, the same. The shakings are in heaven and on earth, and also the return of Christ. I think we just have one, but as John is seeing different effects of the return of Christ. All right, next slide. How we doing? 607. Okay, so I want to unpack a few things here that will help lay some of the stages. We've been talking a lot about Old Testament prophecies and how those are being fulfilled. I want to jump to some things that were happening in the world outside of the Bible that would have been understood very clearly by first century Christians. And when they're reading some of these things about horses that are wearing armor, like, whoa, what is that all about? So I know that there's a lot of modern books and things that say, horses wearing armor. Clearly, these are the armor. These are motorcycles. These are tanks. Locusts that look like these are helicopters. I get that. We go there, but that's not where the mind of first century Christians would have gone. They would have gone to events that they already knew about. So some of the things that are prophesied, messianic pretenders, wars, earthquakes, famine, persecutions, gospels to the nations, are things that had happened or were currently happening in the time of the writing of Revelation. Let's go through these real quick. Messianic pretenders. In Acts 5:36, it actually talks about Thaddeus, who was someone that pretended to be the Messiah and put together quite a bit of a following, and the Romans went and crushed that. Josephus talks about throughout the first century, there were several that showed up and got a bit of a following, some that would go out to the desert, sort of like John the Baptist, and would say, hey, I've been appointed as the Messiah, come and follow me. And the Romans would be like, oh, we got another one. We got another code Messiah out in the desert, and they'd go and crush it. The most well-known comes after Revelation 135 AD. Bar Kokhba was an individual that gained quite a bit of notoriety. The name Bar Kokhba is son of the star. So he claimed to be that a star in the heavens foretold that he was going to be the Messiah. That sounds like a familiar story, doesn't it? A star in the heavens? So he really leaned into that and actually had some very prominent rabbis. Rabbi Akiva believed that Bar Kokhba was the Messiah. And that group also was rounded up and killed. So they would have been aware, if we were first century Christians, yes, others have come and gone. Which is part of why some of the Jews look at Jesus being nailed to the cross and say, another one that we put our hopes in that failed us. Because they didn't understand what he was dying for, right? They didn't understand that greater picture and what it was he had come to do. So, messianic pretenders were happening. Wars were happening, okay? There had been sporadic fighting throughout Judea that led to the Jewish revolt. In fact, the two books that Josephus, the Jewish historian, is most well known for is A History of the Jews that goes all the way back to the time of Abraham and explains to a Roman audience, let me introduce the Jewish people to you and where we came from, all right? But he also had a book called The Jewish Wars that walked through the middle of the first century till the end of the first century, describing a series of battles, some small, some larger, of the Jews against the Romans. And that was to try to explain why in the world would these Jews fight against the power of Rome? They have no way of winning. What are they thinking, right? So the Roman is like, what is up with these Jewish people over here? Why are they so revolting? And so Josephus tried to describe it. So what he describes was these series of conflicts. The most significant, of course, is between 66 AD and 70 AD, a revolt that started in Caesarea and spread to the whole country and eventually ended when the Romans came and destroyed the city of Jerusalem and the temple. Now, that war was taking place, but in that, when he describes the Romans surrounding Jerusalem, you had several Jewish zealot leaders, 3 of them that claimed, I'm the Messiah. No, I'm the Messiah. No, I'm the Messiah. And they actually, the Romans are like, oh, this is handy. They just parked their cars outside the walls and waited and put a siege while the Jews killed each other. So a lot of this idea of famine and disease and siege already was happening. They were very aware of that, all right? So that's the wars. Also, several times in Revelation, it mentions about a force from the east that is coming. And in fact, we know something about this. In Matthew's gospel, you have the Magi. They go rolling up into Jerusalem on their camels or whatever they had with their gifts, and they show up at Herod's court. All they know from the stars have told them, Jewish king, born, new leader, born king of the Jews, not made king of the Jews by the Romans. So they're like, well, let's just go to the capital and we'll ask around. So they show up in Jerusalem. They don't know Bethlehem yet. Show up in Jerusalem, and they ask Herod, who'd been appointed by the Romans. He was not born a Jew. He was a Nabatean. And he's sitting there, and these guys show up from the east. And Herod and all of his court are a little worried about this. Here's why. The Romans had been remarkably successful conquering the Mediterranean region until they got past the Euphrates River and faced the Parthians. They were never able to conquer the Parthians. They eventually beat the Gauls, they eventually beat the Britons, but they never could take the Parthians. Here's why. The Parthians were incredibly skilled at cavalry. They had light, fast horses. They had a light cavalry, and then they had large horses that were the ancestors of the Appaloosas, and they were the heavy cavalry, large, sturdy horses that could be draped with armor. So if you see the picture over here on my left, your right, the top one is the light cavalry, a rider on horseback with archery, the predecessor of Genghis Khan and the Mongol archers. The Mongols learned this and said, oh, those Parthians, those are pretty successful. And so here's what would happen. The Romans would march into battle, make their lines, and they've got pikes and their various things. They were no match for the light, swift cavalry. And so we have the record of a battle. I've got that on there. The Parthian cavalry, 50,000 cavalry are recorded in a battle against Mark Antony. All right? So 50,000, that's a huge force. And they were able to defeat a Roman legion. Here's why. They came and surrounded them, and they were really skilled with their armor. So the Roman soldier, his shield protected him from the front. He's good there, right? But where is he exposed? Well, everywhere else. So if I'm on a quick horse and I can surround you, so what these 50,000 did is, as the Romans marched forward, they fell back to pull him right to the middle, and then they just circled around him and just shot him till they were done. You know, it was a brutal defeat, and the Jewish people knew about it. So when we read in Revelation about 200 million cavalry on horseback crossing the Euphrates with the kings from the east for a great battle, that would have been pretty intense. Whoa, 50,000? They took out a Roman legion. 200 million? Hold up. What are we talking about there? So they already knew about this battle here. Here's the interesting thing. One of the kings of the Persians, Mithridates II, gave himself the title King of Kings. And that's how he wanted to be addressed. So the Parthians as a people are someone that we don't talk about enough in terms of understanding the New Testament and the political climate and what was going on there, and why Jerusalem was freaked out when a group arrived from the east. It was like, hold up, you spies? What are you guys doing here? You know, this doesn't look good. And so they're looking for the real king, the one born of the kings. Okay, so 53, yeah, the battle against Crassus, that was the other one. But I do want you to see here, because we're going to get into this. So you got the light cavalry up in the top, mounted on horseback firing, and then what would happen is the light cavalry would soften it up, and then for the final blow, the heavy cavalry, so in a battle against Crassus that I mentioned here, the light cavalry did, and then the heavy cavalry were hiding in the forest, and then they come marching out. Big, strong horses, able to carry this massive metal armor that they wore. And so they would come out with horseback and finish, with swords, drawn swords and pikes, finish the job by actually stomping on the soldiers that were left. So we read about that, right? That horses wearing armor, we're going to read about that in Revelation, who tread upon armies. This exactly was happening, okay? Yeah.
So you're implying that the Great Tribulation's already happened?
No. The first 5 seals, not seal number 6 and seal number 7. So what I am implying is that when they read about this, the people in the first century wouldn't have been going, man, horses with armor, I don't know what he's talking about. We don't understand. They would have said, oh, wow, he's describing battles like what we've already seen happen. And if it was terrifying to have 50,000 cavalry coming, how much more terrifying to think about 200 million coming across. So what I'm saying here is that these would have been scenes that they would have read and said, we've already been through some things like that. This is 10 times worse, but already things that we've seen happening. So I do think that the first 5 seals, when it talks about warfare, bloodshed, famine, false messiahs, they could look and say, oh yeah, that stuff's already happening. But then it gets worse as we get later into the book. So that's the already and the not yet. So the 6th seal is not yet. All right. Earthquakes in the first century. Philadelphia in 17 AD, huge earthquake hit Philadelphia and shook it to the ground. You also have, very well known in the late 60s, the earthquake that leveled Pompeii. Pompeii is still being excavated, and an understanding of what happened there. And of course, with Pompeii, that's a big one. That happened about 20 years before the writing of Revelation, within 20 or 30 years. And in Pompeii, you have a huge earthquake and a volcano that erupts. And with the eruption of the volcano, you have that pyroclastic cloud that comes down of hot ash and covers the town, all right? Anybody been to Pompeii, by the way? Wow, sweet. That's on my bucket list, yeah. And isn't that amazing of like the cloud comes and now they find the cavities of where bodies were. Like it happens so fast. So Pompeii is also one of those that when people read about a shaking, fire that comes swiftly, they would have been, oh wow, that's like Pompeii. This is something that they would have understood as something that could indeed happen. Then we've got Josephus talks about famine in Judea in the late 70s. During the siege of Jerusalem, there was famine. Most of the people in the city died of famine even before the Romans came in. Persecutions, Acts and Revelation talk about persecutions of the Jews and the Christians by the Romans, so they would have been familiar with that. And as they are reading about the gospel that goes to all the nations, I put a little asterisk there. They would have read that, and we now understand the map a little differently. Paul, in his mind, living in the first century, understood the map that he knew. That if I can, his thought was, if I can just get to Spain, I will have completed the Great Commission.